Welcome to Session 3, Stress in Our Lives and in Our Bodies, Part 1. Now, I'm focusing on stress because we're immersed in stress in our lives, sometimes really overwhelming levels of it. So if we're really hoping to grow our inner capacity to deal with stress and to be able to contribute to improving our health and our well-being, we're going to need to learn how to do this in the face of stress, because we're not going to be able to make all stress go away. So in this session, I'm going to discuss our reactions to stress and how those can really become dysregulated and thus harmful for us. And then in the next session, I'm going to continue this conversation and discuss how mindfulness can support us in increasing our awareness and changing our habits of reacting to things. There can be different definitions of stress. I'm going to use this definition of it being a state of worry or tension caused by a difficult situation. And I also want to highlight stress acts on different levels. So there's always the physiological, psychological, social levels. And as you can expect, all these different levels are constantly interacting with each other. And it's kind of difficult to actually pick them apart a lot of the time. What I want to emphasize really is that, as I said, the reason that I've made 2 sessions on stress and dealing with stress is that stress is a natural part of life and it can't be avoided. So that's why we're talking about adapting to it if we want to survive in successful ways or healthy ways. And people often have these kind of generalized ways of responding to stress. So in an effort to adapt to all these demands and pressures and stressors we experience, a lot of us tend to really kind of have one general way that we deal with all stress, big or small. And so these kind of generalized responses to things, they might in themselves lead to breakdown and disease if they're not adequate and if they become really dysregulated. You can imagine if the way we're dealing with all stressors, big or small, is in the same way and maybe in a really unhelpful way, it can really end up affecting our bodies, minds, relationships, and leading to a lot of breakdown. So the more we can bring attention to the effectiveness of our efforts to cope, the more we're going to be able to guard against this dysregulation and to really understand what might be contributing to making us sick. I like to highlight the stress relationship and call it that because it's really important to understand that how we are in relation to our stress really affects how we experience it. So the stress relationship is a relationship between the person and the environment that's appraised by the person as taxing or exceeding his or her resources and thus endangering his or her well-being. You could see how this definition really highlights that with awareness, we realize that we have some agency. So agency plus awareness makes a huge difference. It's not the potential stressor itself, but it's how we perceive it and then how we handle it that'll determine whether or not this will lead to stress. And this is really excluding more extreme cases where we really don't have much control. If you interpret an event as threatening to your well-being, then it will be taxing on you. But if you see the same event differently, it might not just be stressful to you at all, or at least a great deal less stressful. And it could even be positive. You could see it as something that you might actually handle well and grow from. And so I'm really highlighting the relationship. And since relationality is so fundamental to mindfulness, how you are in relation to yourself, to others, to the world, to this moment, you could see how mindfulness could be really helpful in facing whatever is unfolding in the present moment, appraising it, and then choosing to be in a wiser relationship towards it, especially in how you act and how you handle it. So I really like to highlight change along with stress because I think a lot of the time that's where a lot of stressors come from. we're continually faced with the necessity to change as people. And so if we can learn to see change as an integral part of life, as the rule of things, and not necessarily as a threat to our well-being all the time, we'll be in a much better place to effectively cope with stress. And our mindfulness practice shows us that we're really immersed in a sea of change. Everything is constantly changing. As you sit and meditate, you'll notice that your thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, impulses are all constantly changing. Even inanimate objects are constantly changing. And sometimes us humans being alive for the short amount of time we are in comparison to a lot of other things, we can really trick ourselves into believing that things are unchanging and permanent, but they're not. When our system is functioning adaptively, our automatic reactions can really be life-saving. So it's not always bad to have these automatic reactions. When your car begins to skid, you want to automatically react without thinking. And these are often situations or reactions referred to as fight or flight or freeze reactions. And there's nothing wrong with something being automatic. I really want to highlight that. Like I'm saying, it's adaptive for our survival. However, these beneficial short-term responses to things can really become damaging in the longer term, especially when we're reacting to things that really are not actually life-threatening, but we take them to be. Ultimately, our automatic reactions to stressors that we encounter determine how much stress we actually experience. And you could see how these automatic ways of reacting that are really unhealthy, that over time they can keep really taxing and straining our inner balance and the regulation of our bodies and how they work. And a lifetime of these unconscious and habitual ways of reacting, when unexamined, they can really pose a threat to our breakdown of our bodies and to illness. So we're all walking around with an allostatic load, which is the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. So each time we're experiencing more stressors, more change, life events, we're taking on more of a load. And the way in which we react to stress can continually contribute to this allostatic load. So if we're reacting to things with our alarm reaction, if we're reading things to be threatening, even if maybe they're not, what's actually happening to our body in these fight, flight, freeze reactions? If you think about it, the alarm reaction is our body's way of preparing for defense against something or to be aggressive in our actions. So this is kind of a very hyper-aroused physiological and psychological state that we're putting our body in. So that might look like increased muscle tension, rapid brain firing, and releasing many stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. There's a heightened sense perception, our pupils dilate, our hair stands on end, our heartbeat becomes faster. And at the same time, things like digestion shut down because we're rerouting that blood to bigger muscles so that we can be defensive or aggressive. And sometimes this is experienced by people as feelings of butterflies in your stomach as the blood is moving elsewhere. And then even if we're not kind of in this alarm response and we're doing something like suppressing, we're pushing our emotional arousal deep inside of us, which is also not so good for us. So with these automatic responses of ours, we're really normalizing a huge allostatic load, and a lot of times without even realizing it. And this really compounds unnecessary wear and tear on the body and the mind. If you think of it, that's fight, flight, freeze, alarm response, we're constantly in this hyper aroused state, whether something's actually threatening or not. Having all those things happen to our body, that's not really a normal way of functioning that I was listing on the previous slide. There's actually been a lot of evidence that shows that being in this state a lot can really contribute to a lot of long-term physiological breakdown, resulting in a lot of problems like increased blood pressure, cardiac arrhythmias, digestive problems, headaches, backaches, sleep issues, and even a lot of psychological issues like chronic anxiety or depression or both. And then on the flip side, if we're instead internalizing our stress and contributing to our allostatic load in that way, you could imagine how toxic that might be for your body. When you internalize stress reactions, you don't get the solution, in a sense, that the fight, flight, freeze response does. You don't peak and then get this physical release and then recovery afterwards. Instead, you're just kind of carrying this arousal around inside of you, both in the form of stress hormones, which wreak havoc on our bodies long term, but also in the form of agitated thoughts and emotions that are kind of constantly there under the surface. So what I'm trying to highlight is stress affects our bodies. And this is really important to take in. Our mind is our body. Our body is our mind. They affect each other, short-term and long-term. And so I just point you towards the download that came along with this course, in which I've highlighted a lot of the research on stress and its effect on these different things, and how mindfulness also affects stress and these other topics, such as stress's effect on longevity, on epigenetics, so how our genes are either expressed or not, and that's how diseases are expressed or not, due to things in our environment, our behaviors, our mental health, different things like that. Stress's effect on immune functioning, on emotional intelligence, neuroplasticity, behavior change, pain. So I encourage you to check this out if you want some more detail about stress and mindfulness and what research has said about its effects on these different topics. So what's the role of mindfulness in all this? Well, we really want to learn to respond instead of react to stress, and thus decrease a lot of the really negative effects of stress on us as people, or our allostatic load. And that's so important because it can really prevent further breakdown and really maybe encourage an internal environment that's more conducive to healing and health. So the mindful meditation that I'll be guiding you along in this session will be mindfulness of sound. So just as sensation in the body is used to anchor us to the present moment in things like the body scan exercise, this is also a sensory experience. We're just using sound instead to anchor us to the present moment. So it's, what is this sound in this moment? Can you observe it? So try it out.